So the next major threat to biodiversity that we're going to talk about is disease. So usually disease becomes a problem when pathogens are moved by people to new places. Diseases that species have evolved with, usually they can deal with, and they won't cause major population declines or extinctions. But when we get diseases that come from particularly one continent and are moved to another continent, to species that have never dealt with this disease before, we get major problems. We're seeing that right now with coronavirus. People have never had this kind of coronavirus before, and it's causing a lot of problems. We see the same things in plant and animal populations. Disease is very similar to invasive species. Most of them are related to globalization in that we're moving things around all different parts of the world and connecting continents in ways that they've never been connected before. And these diseases are basically invasive species that are pathogens that cause diseases. So it's pretty much the same idea. Let's see, I mentioned that already. Disease can also be exacerbated by other stressors. So if a species is dealing with pollution or habitat loss or something like that, then they might have a harder time dealing with disease than they would if they just had the disease to deal with. And I mentioned globalization is usually what moves diseases, or normally we would call the pathogen is the organism that causes disease. So globalization leads to pathogens being moved all around. So we get transmission. This is also really important for people. Obviously, we're living through that right now. When there's a lot of disturbances, then diseases can move more easily from wildlife into human populations. And that's what happened with the COVID-19 or the current coronavirus pandemic. They think that it came from pangolins or some other mammals in a wildlife market. Pangolins are extremely endangered and highly trafficked. And when these wildlife come in close contact with people, they have all these pathogens that potentially we're more likely to get if we're disturbing their habitats, if we're hunting them and have them in markets, things like that. And we've seen this over and over again. So like Ebola is an example. It's a wildlife pathogen that as more deforestation has occurred, people are coming into contact with wildlife more, and we're more likely to get outbreaks of Ebola and lots of other pathogens like COVID-19. And so we can also see that we can get pathogen transmission from wildlife to domestic animals and then to people. There's a really interesting bat virus in Australia where people have never, as far as we know, gotten the disease from bats directly, but there are several cases where horses have gotten the bat pathogen, and because horses are so large, they can shed a lot of the virus, and that means that people in close contact with those horses are more likely to get sick. So there's this case, I believe it's called the Hendra virus, where fruit bats infected horses, and then usually the horse owners or the veterinarians trying to treat the horses. There are a few cases where people got that and then died. I think there's a couple of cases where the people recovered as well, but we never got to the stage that we got with coronavirus where we have person-to-person transmission. Those people that got Hendra virus never transmitted it to another person. They only got it from the horse, and those people got sick. But then other people around that person that was sick didn't get it. So that's how we get pandemics, is you need the transmission from one person to another for it to really explode. But there's a lot of pathogens. So as we come into closer contact with wildlife, we destroy habitats more. We're more likely to come in contact with more and more different pathogens. And people had been saying for a long time that it was very likely that a pandemic like COVID-19 was going to happen soon. And because we have globalization, it can get to all parts of the world very quickly. So pathogens, diseases that are problems are often invasive species, and they're often moved by invasive species or domestic species. So in Africa, we have an example where cattle get have rinderpest, and that rinderpest can be transmitted to native wildlife like Cape buffalo and antelope. In Britain, ringneck pheasants will sometimes get nematodes from gray partridges. In Britain, another example, gray squirrels, which are introduced, can transmit popoxovirus to their native red squirrels. And in the United States, we used to have a kind of iconic tree that's functionally extinct. It still exists, but it used to be a dominant canopy species, and now it cannot grow to be of canopy size, and it's the American chestnut tree. And people introduced Chinese chestnuts, and with them they brought a fungus that could also infect the American chestnut tree. And now we don't have American chestnut trees anymore. There are some little scraggly things that I have seen up in the mountains in North Carolina, but they are not the huge trees they used to be. They used to be all over the East Coast, and they were giant. They were these huge trees, and they think actually that the passenger pigeon, the species I talked about that used to darken the skies, used to eat and move around eating the chestnuts off the American chestnut trees. So vulnerability to disease depends on a lot of different factors, and probably a lot of you know a lot more about disease than my previous classes have, having now lived through this pandemic. Probably understand disease ecology a lot better than people have previously. So we know that the probability of infection increases with stress. You know that probably from your own life. When you're really stressed out, when you're not taking good care of yourself, you're much more likely to get sick, get a cold, get the flu. And that's true for wildlife as well. And so stressors that might be affecting wildlife species might be invasive species. It might be stress from habitat destruction or degradation. They might be stressed out because they're in captivity. And that increases the probability that you'll get sick when you're exposed to a pathogen. We also know that frequent contact with hosts favors transmission. So that's what all this social distancing is about. We're trying to minimize the number of contacts so we minimize transmission of a pathogen from one individual to another. So we see this in wildlife as well. So in dense confined populations like zoos, parks, refuges, there's more likely to be pathogen transmission, so transmission from one individual to another. You might be more likely to get it from agricultural species into wildlife species or into native plants. People don't think about it always, but there are lots of plant pathogens as well that make plants sick, and those can get into our native plants. If they're related, like the American chestnut example. We can also get transmission between pets and people. That's a close contact situation. We also know that lower biodiversity favors infection and transmission, and so that's one of those important ecosystem services that we get from having higher biodiversity in our ecosystems. Higher biodiversity dilutes pathogens, so there's not as many of them and not as many hosts that can get them. And so when we get these higher densities of fewer species, they come into contact with each other more likely. and that increases the rate of transmission. There's been a lot of really interesting research about how biodiversity limits how many individuals a pathogen can infect and limits how long a pathogen might be affecting a particular population. So a couple of examples in wildlife. Obviously, we've been talking about examples in people with the current pandemic. So one example is white nose syndrome, and when you read The Sixth Extinction, you will come to a section that's all about white nose syndrome. So you'll get a really good kind of first-hand account about what white nose syndrome in some of these caves looks like and how it affects bat populations. It's basically a fungus from Europe, and they think that it was introduced by accident on somebody's shoes. And this has been devastating to American bat populations and a number of bat species, particularly ones that hibernate in caves. And so where they're pretty sure that white nose syndrome started in the United States is a commercial cave. And people go visit caves to see the caverns and see the different formations and things like that. So they think a tourist from Europe or an American that had recently been to Europe visited this commercial cave wearing shoes that had been in a cave in Europe and probably had a little bit of soil on that shoe that had some of this fungus. And the first populations that started showing up with white nose syndrome were in this commercial cave. And it's a fungus that grows on the snout and sometimes on the wings and ears. You can see this individual has fungus all over its kind of nose and eye and mouth area. There's a little bit growing on its ears here and here. And what it does is it wakes up the bats during hibernation. And it drains the energy they have. So it makes them wake up when they're in the middle of hibernation, in the middle of winter when it's very cold, and they need energy. So they're out, they're flying around, they're using up the little energy they have left that they're not supposed to be using while they're hibernating because they need to eat, but it's the middle of winter and there are no insects. These are insectivore bats. And so almost all of them die because hibernation is an adaptation to dealing with the winter when there's no food available for an insectivore. And so a lot of these bats die, and you'll read the description in The Sixth Extinction, but they're finding caves with very few living bats and lots of dead bats in them. And you can see down here, this is data from West Virginia, and it shows some of the different bat species that have been affected. And it shows the population change in percent. So a number that is close to negative 100% means that that population is almost completely gone. And so you can see that these are 90, 80, 50%. This small-footed bat is doing okay. The Virginia big-eared bat is doing okay. But you can see this list of other bats that are doing really badly. And Indiana bats are actually endangered before white nose came through, and so now they're really having problems. This map shows the spread of white nose syndrome, and it might be hard to see depending on how large your screen is, but so this is the point in New York, the cave where white nose started. And this was thought to occur in 2006 or 2007. The purple is where the fungus had gotten by 2008 to 2009. The kind of aqua blue color in here, that's 2009 to 2010 winter. The green is the 2010 to 2011. And you can see it's expanded out. And by now it's made it in a lot of places. It's made it to Washington State. It's made it to Missouri and Oklahoma and near us. We don't have a lot of cave roosting bats, so the bats in Louisiana are affected very much. Most of our bats roost in trees because we don't have a lot of caves. It doesn't get super cold, so they don't need to hibernate as long. So Louisiana's probably okay for the most part, but anywhere that's cold that has bats is probably, once it gets there, is going to be a major problem. Another example is the chytrid fungus. Amphibians are of the vertebrate groups, like birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. Amphibians are the most threatened of all those groups. About a third of amphibians are threatened with extinction. A third of the species, not a third of the individuals. And a huge part of that is a fungus called the chytrid fungus. And it has been spreading, and some of the biggest declines have been in Central America, where just whole groups of frog species have been wiped out. And this has caused massive extinctions. These declines happened way before white nose, so we don't really know if white nose is going to cause extinctions yet, but it hasn't so far. Chytrid fungus has definitely caused extinctions. And we see that we have data from some different areas, and we have information on how it's spread through South America and through Central America. And if you'll remember, we talked about where there's a lot of biodiversity. The Amazon, this part of the world, has the highest biodiversity of amphibians in the world, mostly frogs. The United States has the highest diversity of salamanders, but there are a lot of frog species, and quite a few of them have gone extinct because of this chytrid fungus. And it eats the keratin in their skin and messes up their osmoregulation, so their ability to balance salts and waters. And this shows the fungus growing inside the skin of an amphibian. And that's it for disease.